those all-important counselling foundations, where we look today at that therapeutic relationship, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I was really interested. Earlier on this week, I was listening to a radio program on LBC, the London Broadcasting Company or Corporation. And one of the presenters was talking about why therapy works. He'd had his own therapy and he was interested in why therapy works. And I was so tempted to ring him and actually give him a few facts, because we kind of know why therapy works. And one of the reasons that therapy works is because we know that if there's a good therapeutic relationship and it's sustained, almost certainly that will lead to a better outcome in therapy for the clients. And it was the work of John Norcross and something called Common Factors that was done by John Norcross at Scranton University in Pennsylvania. A huge piece of research done a number of years ago, which reinforced the fact that, and we've talked about this in the podcast before, that the relationship, the quality of the relationship is a significant factor. And I think sometimes, Ken, that's forgotten, that, it's easy, isn't it, to get caught up in theory and think about the theories and applying the theories. But actually, what really, really matters is that I-thou relationship. I'm speaking about Buber, of course, that famous I-thou, not I-it. We see the person as a real person. And how we build and sustain that relationship. And I think that is where the work is, Ken.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. My heart jumped for joy when I saw this topic, Rory. And in episode 208 of the Counselling Tutor podcast, if you skip back one episode, you're going to hear Rory and I speaking about rapport building. And again, focusing on how important that relationship is, the relationship between the practitioner, between the person coming in, whether it be in a counselling relationship or a helping relationship. So important. And I love how you kind of link that into why therapy works, because it's a relationship of a different kind. But when we're speaking about a therapeutic relationship, it is, of course, a contracted relationship, and it is a boundaried relationship. So yes, within that relationship, we're going to build the rapport, but we do need, of course, to visit the boundaries that hold that relationship together as part of it being a therapeutic relationship.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you've actually hit the nail on the head there, Ken. Because when we have good boundaries and solid boundaries, we can be compassionate, we can be empathic, we can be everything we can be to the counsellor. And I think it was Bern Brown, the very famous American psychologist, who said that when you have boundaries, some of the most compassionate, empathic people she met have very, very strong boundaries. And I think certainly for some clients, certainly those who've had difficult childhoods, those who've had difficult relationships, having a boundaried therapist in the therapy room is so important, because it speaks, I think, to containment, containing and holding the client in a space so they can self-regulate. It's incredibly important. And I guess to some extent, part of the therapeutic relationship is what sometimes referred to as respectful reparenting, where you're kind of echoing what a good parent should do in terms of setting boundaries, being respectful, being thoughtful, but and also, of course, being present, Ken.
Yeah, 100%. Being present, and Carl Rogers speaks about that psychological contact as being the first of those conditions recognized as necessary and sufficient for psychological process to take place for this person. And being present is part of that psychological process, that person understands they are in a relationship with another human being, that human being is integrated within that relationship for the benefit of them and that they bring in. And you can't phone that in. You can't be at a distance. You can't be contemplating what you're going to be having for dinner, because that psychological contact will fail at that point. How many times have you been in a conversation where either you yourself have felt yourself drift off, glaze over a bit, and find yourself coming back in going, what have they just said? What's just happened in those few seconds or in those few moments? Or alternatively, how many times have you felt yourself in a relationship where you're telling somebody something and you can see them switch off? You can actually see, it's almost like the light goes out of the eyes as you can see that they may even be nodding and moving their head, but you feel that there's that lack of that connection, that is so important, specifically in the therapeutic relationship. And we touched on boundaries just before coming on to this. And boundaries are great because they're in place there for the client. And it kind of sets the stage. It sets out the area where the therapy takes place. And we spoke about boundaries only recently when we were speaking about one of our focus on self topics, on how boundaries protect us. And I think in order for us to be our best self when we present in the therapeutic room, the boundaries are there, yes, so that the client knows where the operating area is of the relationship, but also to keep us well, that we're not being contacted outside of the sessions, that we're not being called upon when we're not there in that special capacity, because it does take, I guess, to be fully integrated into that therapeutic relationship, it does take a level of being your best self. It doesn't mean that you're not your real self or your true self, but you are certainly putting your best self forward. And it ties into the topic we're going to be looking at next, where we're speaking about counseling through your own adversity, which we'll get to in a moment. But when you've got stuff going on, can you be your best self? And we'll look at that more in adversity. But boundaries is one way of kind of protecting that space for yourself as well, to be your best self in that therapeutic relationship.
Absolutely. And of course, Rogers wasn't wrong, in those 7 necessary and sufficient conditions published in the Journal of Consulting Psychology in 1957. Not that I have a copy on my bedside table or anything. No. One of the things he talked about were those 6 conditions.
Yeah.
Was that at some level the client accepted the congruence and unconditional positive regard of the counsellor. In other words, the client did the buy-in of what was going on and said, yes, this person's accepting me, this person is here for me. And I think that speaks hugely to the therapeutic relationship. And you're absolutely right, Ken, when we talk about boundaries. One of the things that really impacts on boundaries is Transference, my old friend. It comes to talk with me again. I'm not going to sing it, but no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to. And one of the interesting things is that one of the things that can really impact on boundaries is if the client sees you as somebody else other than the therapist. In other words, you're an echo of a relationship of the past. And part of sustaining a therapeutic relationship is to manage the transference, or to manage your own transference and the counter transference that comes from it. And I think that even if you're a person-centered therapist, and I've had so many debates about this, that we don't, in person-centered therapy, we don't particularly talk a lot about transference, but it is a phenomenon that happens. And I think we have to acknowledge, even Rogers acknowledged it in client-centered therapy. There's a whole chapter, I think, on transference. And I think when you form that therapeutic relationship, being certain what constitutes maybe some transference from the client and be able to repair it and refocus the transference into the here and now is absolutely so important, because that's one of the things that can kind of topple over a therapeutic relationship if they see you as somebody else from their past.
Yeah, this brings up an amazingly good point, and that is that we're speaking about therapeutic relationship. The therapeutic relationship is a relationship. And when we use the word relationship, it doesn't mean that everything is happy and smiley and sunny and the birds are singing and everything is going absolutely perfectly. And you only need to look at your own life to strong relationships that you hold, to recognize that relationships have ebbs and flows. They have beginnings. They have a process of forming the relationship, getting to know one another, trusting one another in the relationship. So you can have a relationship with somebody that you've just met maybe a week or so ago, and that might be very different to somebody that you've maybe known for 20 years. There would be a different depth in the relationship. Still a relationship, but they are idiosyncratic in that they would be different depending on who you're working with. The relationship element means that it is two people. It is a relating. It's not one-sided. We can't transmit out this magical relationship. It is a two-person interaction that causes this relationship. You've brought in Transference, Rory, and almost got you to sing the song there. No. One day. You've brought that in that may impact on boundaries and may slightly strain or make it more difficult for the practitioner or the client to be present within the relationship in the here and now. And there are other elements, such as maybe the use of immediacy, which is an advanced counselling skill, where the counsellor might use immediacy and get it wrong. Immediacy can go wrong, and that might slightly fracture that therapeutic relationship. And you've got challenge that would come into that relationship, challenge introduced into the relationship, where that could be tough for the client to have challenge presented in front of them. And of course, these skills, when we're speaking of immediacy, when we're speaking of challenge, we would look to the stages of a therapeutic relationship, and we certainly would only bring that in when the relationship was fully formed, where there was trust within it, where the relationship was robust enough to maybe handle a small bit of a fracture that could then be repaired. But we must recognize, if we're speaking about a therapeutic relationship, that it's not all plain sailing, and therapeutic relationships can break down. I've certainly had it. I don't say that with great pride, because maybe there's an element of self that thinks, how did I fail that client? But I've had a therapeutic relationship that broke down. Boy, did I take that to supervision, and it's still with me today.
I'm sure he did, Ken, and I think that speaks to the reality of what therapists do. When people think of a therapeutic relationship, I sometimes wonder if there's this kind of idealized view that it's all nice and sunshine and roses, and actually it can be pretty stormy. It can be pretty stormy, and I think one of the things that the research shows is that it's not just sustaining a therapeutic relationship. It's being able to repair ruptures.
Yeah,
it's being able to maybe say, I'm really sorry, I made a mistake here, or have I said something. And stepping out and owning up, because we're only human, and sometimes we may get on the wrong track. And also, I think that sometimes one of the things that can bump a therapeutic relationship is overuse of self-disclosure. I think self-disclosure needs to be really, really thought out. And I've known certainly student colleagues who have taught have given a little self-disclosure, maybe a little too much. And that has really rocked the therapeutic relationship. But yes, repairing it, going out of your way to repair it. And what I would say is that sometimes some fractures can't be repaired.
Yeah.
I think that in my experience, sometimes no matter how hard you try, once the relationship's ruptured, you really need to think about, well, is this meaningful? Is this meaningful in service of the client? Am I the right therapist for the client? Maybe that a respectful referral is put into place.
Yeah, that is certainly something to process, to think about. Something to take away from this is what you do, what your process is. If you have a therapeutic relationship that you find is not going as you would want it to be, it's not being held as you would want it to held. And it's not always from the therapist side. It can come from either side. If you're working within a therapeutic relationship, there is an onus on the client that they bring themselves, that they bring their material, that they bring a willingness to engage in what they're bringing. So there is a responsibility from both sides. And I think if there's any takeaway from this, it is that that relationship is a two-way communication. You can't broadcast out a relationship. You're going to bring the elements that you can bring into the therapeutic relationship. You'll have the profession elements, you'll have the boundaries, you'll have the contract that wrap around, you'll have your way of being. You will be there with those facilitative conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, incongruence, being your true self. We know from the literature that will create the environment for that therapeutic relationship. But yeah, they have ebbs, they have flows. It is two-way. And I think worth talking about, worth chatting to peers about, if you're studying, worth speaking with your fellow course members about, worth journaling about. Look at your therapeutic relationships if you're in practice. Do they differ? Are they all the same? Mm-hmm. Is there an idiosyncrasy? Is there different ways that the relationship may be with different people? Is that okay? Yeah. It is okay, because they are relationships. And by the very nature of relationships, my relationship with Rory is different to my relationship with my wife. They're both relationships and they're both special to me, but they do differ.
It's true, Ken. And, you know, one of the newer, more kind of progressive aspects within the therapeutic relationship is radical empathy, where you may meet someone whose values are totally opposite to yours, and you use what's sometimes referred to as radical empathy, where you try and enter that person's frame of reference and bracket your own value system to try and see the world. And you know, I've certainly worked with colleagues who work with you know, people on the sex offenders register, and they've worked with, you know, the perpetrators of some pretty horrific behaviors, and they managed to sustain a therapeutic relationship, but they've had to bracket their own frame of reference very, very tightly and have very, very tight supervision. But it's amazing it can be done, and that's sometimes referred to as radical empathy. But yes, I think that, you know, speak about this in your peer group, talk about it in supervision, and maybe, you know, ask your tutor about their experience. I mean, I was very, very keen, and I know we both were, Ken, when we taught together, to share with our students our experiences in a broad sense, not specific clients, but a broad sense of what the therapeutic relationship meant, and maybe being really honest about what happens when it works really well, and having to, you know, part from a client and what you're left with. You know, because if you've had a really strong relationship and that client isn't coming again, that can bring up a few feelings of loss. Or conversely, if you've tried to sustain a therapeutic relationship, it's fractured. Again, like Ken was saying, what does that leave you with? I think it's something that should be discussed a lot, because it's a whole lot more than the theories and everything else. It's the real, well, it's the meat and potatoes, as they say in my part of the world, of counselling, isn't it? The meat and potatoes.